Welcome to Watershed Chats. Watershed moments are traditionally understood as a division or distinction between two phases. They can be turning points that define our shared history. Here, we sit down with experts and those having a go at building and dreaming new ways into fruition for a healthy and habitable future on planet Ocean. Dr. Liz Hawkins is a marine ecologist who spent more than 20 years researching cetaceans. Liz is the founder and CEO of Dolphin Research Australia, where she heads up research and education about the social systems, communication, population dynamics, and health of dolphins in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Gubbi Gubbi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. How did you end up devoting your life to dolphins? What led you here?
It's true, I've had the greatest privilege to study these animals. In so many ways, these dolphins have led me. The connection to them for me is beyond a lot of other connections. I think for me, they're a little bit more of a kin to me. I know I am a scientist, but yes, I'm a scientist, but I also feel for these animals a lot. And they have taught me a lot in my life. They have directed me a lot in my life. And for me to be able to give back to them in whatever way I can in their environment is just always been my destiny, I guess. But having said that, it hasn't happened without a lot of hard work and a lot of challenges along the way. It's not been an easy run, that's for sure. So to go into the world of academia was always a challenge, but did my degree, and after that degree went into postgraduate studies, and I was very lucky. I had the opportunity to study the dolphins of Pondamuka, and specifically a small group of dolphins there. And that work was very much trying to understand their communication systems and how they interact with each other. So it was hours and hours of sitting with headphones on, listening to dolphins, communicating with each other and observing their behaviours and trying to interpret all of that and what it meant for them and their world. Then I was lucky after that study, I continued on to look at the dolphins of Byron Bay and look at their population abundance and actually start to look at a population that we knew at the time nothing about. So that work has definitely continued. It's now been 20 years of studying dolphins and whales. It sounds ridiculous because I don't feel that old. But, in all this time, what's amazing is still how little we know. And it's still a very young science. And every time we're out there, it is a great privilege because these animals will show you something, and it's a little bit more of their life and how they're living out there in the environment. But we still don't know a lot about what happens beneath. And that's something that is, continuously evolving and moving in our industry. Part of my endless fascination and wonder with them is to look at the relationships that they have with each other. For example, they will all help each other through hardships in a way. They'll help each other to survive every day in that environment. They'll work together to find food. At least some of the species were very cooperative with each other. So they'll do things like, help each other find food. They'll help each other hunt. They'll help each other take care of their offspring to protect them from potential threats. And that, to me, that relationship I'm quite fascinated about because it's quite a rare thing in the animal world, and it's something that we share very much with them in our human societies. They can also be extremely empathetic towards each other. They can be sad, they can be happy. And yes, I said that as a scientist, and it's taken scientists a long time to say those words. Yes, animals have emotions. They have personalities. They have character.
What do you observe when you see a dolphin looking sad or acting sad? Because most people would be like, yeah, right. They're always smiling.
They're definitely not always smiling. A great example of that would be their mourning process. If they have a loss of offspring, they can carry that offspring for weeks in absolute mourning. They'll carry them on their rostrum, they'll carry them on their backs. They will hold on to that little one until its body is decaying. And it's often the mother on her own. Sometimes it might be the rest of the pod, if depending on the species, might, come in and check in on her. But there is no mistaking that in that moment she is mourning. So how do you feel when you're mourning? You're not happy, are you? You're quite sad and you're just trying to process what's going on. These are very intelligent animals. They have the ability to process a lot of social interaction and acoustic knowledge and worldly knowledge for their environment as well. So in those moments, there is no doubt that that animal would not be feeling happy. That's the best example, I think.
I'm really interested in the delicate dance between the moral and emotional subjective reality of being a human being and trying to fit that into the context of science. And it sounds like that's a real dance for you as well. And I feel really fortunate to be on the fringes of a scientific world that is opening up more to the interrelations between those two formerly dichotomous parts of our being. How do you dance that? How do you do science without having a moral compass? I guess is really the question. Like, what's the point of doing science if you don't have a deep and meaningful reason?
I mean, I can't speak on behalf of all scientists. I think, none of us fit in a box. For me, in my earlier parts of my career, there was certainly a lot of criticism, from mentors, shall we say, that would put the big red pen across any emotive language, any language which would suggest that these animals are a who, not a that, so to speak. And being young, you go with that. And that's always been tradition in science. It's always a that. And I think as I've grown, especially to get to know these animals, it's ridiculous to not call them a who. They are individuals.
To acknowledge their personhood, their thinking, feeling personhood.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that there has been, in the world of ethology, the study of animal behaviour, there's been a lot of work done with dolphin personalities and trying to define and prove they have a personality, for example. Or a dog has a personality and they have feelings and emotions.
There's not a person who's had a dog or a cat in their life who would argue that dogs and cats aren't persons of their own who have thoughts and feelings and sentience. Like, only a completely removed perspective with no personal experiential knowledge could say something like that, right?
It would seem that way, but I think at the same time there is still a tradition there in science that we need to, not be emotionally involved with our subjects. We need to be removed, to be impartial, to be able to interpret the experiment or the findings without having that emotive interruption. But for me, I don't really approach things in that way, and I think at this time it's really wonderful to see that there has been an evolution in the science. It is moving along. People are much braver now to break those traditional molds, to say these animals are a who, and yes, they might feel this, and we can prove that because of this and this and this. You need to be able to define that. Of course, you're never making the assumption. It's always measured in some way in science to be able to prove it. And it's a funny thing because often intuitively we might know something, and Of course they have personalities, but until you prove it, you need to have the evidence for it to be able to back that up, and that's what science does, but we have to have the protocols there. But I think for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about the world these animals live in and their perceptions and their perspectives and what's meaningful for them and their survival out in the ocean. So for me, thinking so much about that, it's hard not to take on who they might be, what characteristics are unique to those individuals as well.
Liz, so with the incredible amount of hours you would have spent with the local populations in our region, I'm a real sucker for stories. I want a couple of stories out of you because I know, because all of us who have interactions with cetacea anywhere around the world, specifically around here, you get surfing dolphins nearly every time you're surfing, especially around the Byron region.
And they're the most incredible, skilled surfers.
Just blown our minds. The things we've seen them do behind where we live, where there's some backwashy headlands that create really dynamic wave motion. So that's a 7-mile broken head sort of pod. Yeah. They will ride upside down, heading straight towards the rocks with their bellies up towards the sky, almost hydroplaning, but upside down, right on the surface, and then just leap out of the face of the wave upside down, corkscrew in the air, then land right side up, then shoot out the back of the wave and just, perilously close to the rocks. So we can watch them right from there. And I've seen this for years. And just incredible stuff. And when we get little snippets from people like yourself who can give us a little more insight into that, we're seeing those behaviours, but a little bit more information deepens the relationship for us, and we feel that when we then pass that information on to other friends who might not know so much about the residents in the area. And so I would just love to know your current perspective on our resident dolphins in this area. What are they up to? How is their health? How is the space that they're inhabiting? Any trends that are happening? Yeah, just a real dive into it. Yeah, their numbers.
Their population numbers too.
It's who are they? How can they teach us to surf like that? Are they healthy? Basically, just tell me everything you know.
Our Byron dolphins are pretty special characters indeed. And, I think I started the PhD work in 2003 here, and that's continued. So we're still out there observing these animals. And I have records of some of the females in particular from 2003 to now still living in our area. I mean, the main species we have here are the Indo-Pacific bottlenose dolphins. So they're probably one of our most abundant coastal species that we get in Australia. The IUCN has recently listed them on the red list as near threatened. So while we are very lucky here to see them, almost every time we're down at Cape Byron or down the beach at Broken, the species in general is at the level of endangerment. They are threatened to endangerment and potential extinction if they're not protected. So for a study like we have in Byron, where we're looking at these long-term trends and trying to understand aspects of the ecology and reproductive biology of these animals and how well they're doing out here, I always call them our ambassadors for the species. And they were that, when we first met, you guys were doing the Taji campaign, the visual petition, and I put in that petition a whole bunch of photos of our Byron dolphins as ambassadors for the Taji dolphins, because they're so lucky here to be free and to not experience that direct threat. And they still are ambassadors of their kind, absolutely. For this population in our area where we live is a subtropical zone, so we get a lot of intermixing of currents. There's quite a few upwellings here, and this kind of environment can support a lot of higher order predators like your sharks and your dolphins. So we actually do have a fairly dense population of bottlenose dolphins here. From the first estimates I had during the early period of my PhD work all those moons ago, we estimated what we call a superpopulation to be over 1,000 animals. So that means we have about that amount, give or take, moving in and out of our area within a year. So if we think of this population as a bit of a pizza, we can slice it up into a different communities of dolphins, if you like. So we have resident dolphins that will have a relatively defined area of movement or home range. And within that home range, they'll have areas that are critical to their survival, what we call core areas of use that have areas of critical importance to those animals. Then we have our visitors, and that can be animals that are regularly coming in and out of this area. They might be here a couple of times a week, they might come in every month. And in our area in Byron, they can be some pretty big pods as well. So we can have, pods of over 100 cruising through this coast.
Are some of these dolphins nomadic and some are more homebody and are based in the nooks and crannies along the coast and stay there?
Yeah. Homebodies is a good way to call our residents. It's a nice little label for them. They don't roam very far. So for us here, we have some of these females that we know will go within, say, a 55-kilometre stretch of coastline and not too much further. And they'll only go to about 3 nautical miles to sea, typically. Then the visitors, for example, they're a little bit of regional travellers, shall we say, and they might have a bit of a bigger home range. So they might have, for example, a 100-kilometre range, but not much further than that. And again, 3 nautical miles to sea, and that's the species limit. And then we'll have the transient animals, and they're the ones we'll see once and never again. So they might just cruise through. But what we're discovering with our work with the organisation is we've got a lot of projects in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland, and what we're finding is that there's not a huge amount of intermixing within this zone. So we actually do have some what is appearing to be fairly discrete populations and communities. So often the resident communities, our little homebodies, are often made up primarily of females and their offspring. They're our nursery groups. And the community that we have focused a lot of our work on is the Cape Byron female community, and observing where they go, how they use space, how they interact with each other. And we have managed to define the areas of critical habitat for them and their survival, which has been a big part of that work. And we also know that they have been using that critical habitat for centuries, potentially, and that's from Indigenous knowledge and storytelling. And a big part of our work has also been trying to integrate traditional ecological knowledge into what we know in the modern science, or what's so-called Western science, and integrating that TEK so that we can basically create better management and conservation initiatives.
Can you share with us some of those stories, some of the stories or the ways that traditional landowners here would have interacted with dolphins? Are there stories? And
there are stories, but I probably prefer not to say it just because I don't have permission. Yeah. So the aunties have shared.
What about in a generalized sense?
In a generalized sense, with the Arakwal people, there is definitely a very strong relationship with the local dolphins in the Byron area, and that's an incredibly strong relationship. And there's aspects of that relationship which, from my observations, are just quite remarkable, actually. But to actually also know, for example, that these animals have been so site specific to this critical habitat area for so long, when we're trying to look at ways to protect that space and try to, make recommendations around that, that's a really important piece of information, because if we put extra protections over that space, it means it will hopefully affect generations of dolphins, and it doesn't mean we have to move that space all the time like other areas perhaps. But our Byron dolphins, you talk about them and their surfing behaviours, and one thing we share between humans and dolphins is we all have culture, and that culture can be shared in many different ways, and it can become different traditions as well. So dolphins actually do have a very strong cultural component to their lives. In our area, part of that culture, I believe, is surfing. These animals, I always feel sorry for populations that don't get to surf. It's like they're missing out, guys.
Are you speaking about humans or dolphins still?
Dolphins.
Yeah.
But for our dolphins here, as you say, they are some amazing surfers. And I want to know if you've ever been able to you yourself, Dave, do the inverted surf.
Yeah.
And
I'm still working on it. Not for showing or sharing with anyone yet. I've got to perfect that one. But what have you seen? So when you're at the Cape, because I know off the tip of the Cape there is a lot of activity.
Yeah.
You're seeing that as part of their culture is riding waves.
Yeah, and you see it from, we've seen mothers teaching their newborns how to surf. They'll be a day old and his mum taking him in to the sets to teach them how to work these waves. And on that level, for them, it's part of their survival. Those little ones have got to know how to deal with waves from a very young age. Then there's elements of how to use those waves to their advantage. So we've seen particularly adolescents that will practice a lot of mating behaviours and interaction between the opposite sexes. We've seen, and within the bottlenose dolphin world, they are well known for some of their not so good antics, where the males might herd females to try and coerce her and mate with her. And often that can be quite aggressive. But we've seen females actually working the waves to avoid males in that situation and working those waves perfectly to get away from them. We've seen them actually mating while surfing as well in amongst the wave, which I think is amazing.
How could life get any better than that? Are you for real? My eyes are like saucepans right now thinking that. Right, okay, yeah. Carry on.
How many animals can say they can do that, mate while surfing? And I guess there's definitely a fun element to it, and, the pure joy that, there's not necessarily an advantage to them surfing. Quite often it does seem to be fun, but there's examples there of how they use waves to optimize their survival and to deal with different social situations. They also use the waves to optimize feeding and to ambush prey. So they can sneak up on a wave and ambush an unsuspecting item of prey. They can use the waves to also herd fish into gutters. So the schools of fish will end up in these dense shoals sitting in a gutter, where the dolphins will just work the waves to keep them there and corral them there and just have their fill. And of course, working together while they're doing that. So in that way, there's definitely a part of that surfing world to them which helps. And then there's the other side where you think absolutely it's unmistakable fun and they're just trying to have a little show off and it is that cultural component of their world which can be linked into that dynamic as well.
Wonderful. Oh, what great insights, Liz. It's an interesting situation where we were just talking about this, how we have these really fortunate encounters a lot in this part of Australia. And what I find really wonderful when we get to speak with someone like yourself is a little, further insight and a deepening of their world and their culture, which I love the way you're speaking of this. And so it's interesting to me because, as traveling surfers over the years, we've seen that a lot of places there's not that kind of interaction. It's like if you wanted to learn about an animal, then you read up on it first, or you watch the documentary, you get what you can, and then you go out and try and seek an interaction or an observation of that animal. Whereas here, we're having these encounters. And so it feels really important, especially right now, given the state of our rivers and the state of our oceans, that we deepen these understandings, and especially of these key creatures in local ecology, and that's a real motivator for us wanting to have this chat with you, because it feels like this is a time where there are a lot of open ears in the world. People are really wanting to know what's going on, and so I guess that's leading to where Lauren was wanting to know the threats on that population that we love so much, and that people come to this region to observe.
It just seems like there's hardly a more beloved species than dolphins. How can they be threatened?
So recently there was a co-signed letter by over 350 research scientists and marine mammal scientists. It's an open letter, and it's a letter of concern for the global status of cetaceans. The IUCN has listed about 30% of cetacean species as threatened, so threatened, near threatened, endangered, or critically endangered. And that's of the species that have been assessed. There's another about 25 to 30% of species that are data deficient, where we haven't been able to either get enough information to properly assess how they're going or not. And then we have few that are of least concern, which are deemed, they're on a good path. The majority of the species that are listed as threatened are actually coastal dolphins and porpoises. There are quite a few species of great whales that still remain on that list. Of course, a lot of them have managed to recover to a certain point, but then a lot of the great whale populations still haven't recovered, or they're starting to decline again in some cases. But our coastal dolphins is something that might surprise a lot of people, because a lot of us coastal dwellers and, the majority of global populations, do live on the coast. And if we're lucky to see dolphins, we think they're fine because they're there. What people don't realise is that a lot of these species are, as you said, homebodies. They have the equivalent of a house with their little boundaries. They have a kitchen, they have a bedroom, habitats that they will need to access to get enough food, to rest, and to be able to protect their offspring and themselves. A lot of people might not realise that because of their culture and because of that strong connection they have to place, they've been taught to optimise how to use these habitats to the benefit of their survival. That when those habitats might be in decline, or there might be different stresses around or different disturbances around, they don't just move away. That cultural component, and that often the learning from their mothers, a lot of the learning in these societies of particularly toothed whales will happen along the matriline from mothers to offspring. So we're often finding that if they have a lot of site fidelity, that they're born into that place, then it isn't easy for them to leave that place. They know how to survive in that space. So if they are experiencing a lot of stresses, they will often remain in that place to their demise. And we are seeing that over and over again at the moment with different populations and species that might also be very niche orientated. So they might only, have a particular type of habitat that they can survive within and certain kind of environmental conditions. And we're seeing not just species on that red list, increasing, but we're seeing subpopulations being added into that list as well because of these conflicting factors and the multiple stresses these animals are facing. And that creates a cumulative pressure on our coastal dolphins. So globally, it is seen that fishing impacts, and particularly gill netting, is one of the biggest threats to our small cetaceans in particular. We have habitat loss and prey loss, and that can be from coastal development, pollution, both point source, litter and noise pollution as well, to things like boating activities, dredging, and fishing interactions, where even recreational fishing can pose a very large threat to these animals in certain areas, and climate change as well. So all of these factors are creating what I call a cocktail of threatening processes, and that's what is affecting our coastal dolphins. No matter where you are in the world, there is one of those or a combination of those that will be affecting our local dolphins. For us here, as I say, our Byron Bay dolphins are very lucky because they don't have quite as many threats as others. However, in Quandamooka country, where we have been studying now for quite a long time those dolphins, that's a great example of what we call an urban environment where those populations are being inundated by all sorts of pressures. And we don't know how well these populations are going just yet with our work. We're still so-called crunching numbers. But we do know, for example, in southeast Queensland, which in Australia is where we experience some of the greatest intensity of human activity, including boating and fishing and pollution and habitat degradation. All of those are very big in that area. And for our local resident populations of bottlenose dolphins and also the Australian humpback dolphins up there, we know that they are experiencing a lot of direct threats. There's preliminary results that indicate, for example, that the Australian humpback dolphins in that population have very high pollutant loads, for example, from DDTs and organic pollutants, of course, all the pesticides. We know that there's a lot of them that have injuries and scars from vessel strikes, because we do have one of the highest densities of vessel activities up there. We know that a lot of them are also carrying injuries and scarring from fishing line entanglements, and unfortunately a lot of that seems to be from recreational line, not commercial. So we're still quantifying a lot of that, but the preliminary results are very compelling, and it is highlighting an example of a highly impacted population. What we don't know is how well they can adapt and at what level they can tolerate these different stresses to the point where they're okay versus they're not okay. So that's where these long-term monitoring programs are really, really important, because for dolphins, they are incredibly long-lived animals. They're at the top of the food chain. They're indicators of environmental health and how well the entire ecosystem is going as well. But in order to get that knowledge, you really need to have these multi-year studies, definitely.
So Dolphin Research Australia is tapping into types of citizen science here too, where I saw that there's, a lot of hours have been spent over the years of people observing. How can people participate in what you're doing and adding to this long range research and this clearer picture of what's going on in the water and in these animals?
Yeah, we are a volunteer organisation, and we do everything from, having crew in-house sifting through lots and lots of data and images of these animals to also encouraging the community to help us monitor them through your everyday recreational activities where you can just report your dolphin sightings, and it's really easy, and those sightings can be really helpful for us in not just areas where we have research programs, but also outside of those areas. Wherever we are in Australia in particular, we don't know very much about our coastal dolphins. And this is where the communities that, if you're lucky to live on the coast or visit the coast, you can actually help to get to know these unknown populations just by reporting a sighting to us. And that can help from, looking at things like, do we look like we might have a resident community there? Or we've had citizen scientists help us a lot to monitor animals in distress as well. We have, again, in Moreton Bay, we have recently had quite a few animals entangled in different types of ropes, which unfortunately seem to be from quite a few crab pots in the bay, and our citizen scientists have helped us actually locate these animals continuously, and that means we can get them help. We can try and get to them to disentangle them from that and get them care. So just eyes on the water can be really, really helpful to really not just care for individuals like those ones that are entangled, but also understanding and monitoring these populations around our coastline.
When you look at the arc of time that you've been looking at the populations around here, how does it feel right now? Like when you look at, I'm really curious, of course, about the Byron sort of region, Ballina, Byron, up this way too. How are the numbers of the population there? Are things in a pretty steady sort of rate? Has there been any really troubling blips in the timeline lately?
We're still crunching numbers on the trends. So we don't know whether they're stable or going up or down at the moment. Hopefully we'll get that answered in the next 6 months with some very fancy stats, but we still don't know with our area, as crazy as that sounds. I know we do have some of our resident communities in our area that are so reliant on our estuarine environments that they are what I call the most vulnerable, because they are reliant on some of the most degraded habitat we have. And unfortunately, in our northern New South Wales area, we do have one of the poorest quality rivers and estuarine systems in New South Wales. And we're still working on monitoring that community that rely on that estuary and also other estuaries. It's a big part of our work.
Is that the Richmond?
Yeah.
The Richmond River.
The Richmond
so that's
River.
For people who don't know, that's what comes out of Ballina, and it's just south of the whole Byron region, which is, I guess you'd call it upstream. So things come out of there that would start travelling. Well, interestingly, so you've got the current out wide, which is going south,
yeah,
but you have your inshore drifts that are going north. So when you look at what's coming out of that river, and I'm sure the Clarence has got its own problems and the Tweed the same, when things come out of there that aren't meant to be in there, so if it's from industrial ag, they're going out. Are they ballooning out north and south and east, or do things come out and just sort of hug the coast and cause problems quite close to shore?
It depends on your conditions. So sometimes that plume will stretch north. Other times it'll sort of ooze out in every direction. But Ballina is actually a really interesting place because we do have our resident little community that, relies on that estuary through their day-to-day life. You know, they rest in the river mouth and they feed up the river. It's a really interesting place they've chosen there. And we also have some really dynamic little systems actually just offshore where we get big numbers of dolphins running through, and they're often the visitors, but we also get huge numbers of common dolphins running through there. And commons are incredible oceanic species. They're one of my favourites. Whenever I'm tour guiding or something, I can't hold my excitement when I see those guys. But we do see them in, you know, big numbers and quite large aggregations off Ballina.
We spoke a little bit about how people can contribute to your work in particular, but for folks who are listening around the world who maybe aren't local and can't set their eyes on local waters, how can people who care about dolphins in particular contribute to their health and well-being?
For us, it doesn't matter where you are. You can always help dolphins, and not only dolphins, but every other animal and every other habitat that they are connected to, because we are all connected in one way or another. For everyone, no matter where you are, you can do very easy things in your everyday life. And I always say, you know, simple things make a very large collective change, and have no doubt that those simple things make a difference. And it's things like saying no to single-use plastics. It's things like picking up trash. It's things like being an aware consumer and, you know, thinking about what you are consuming, whether it's everything from clothing to what you're eating. Is that seafood sustainable? How did it come to the supermarket? And just, you have the power as a member of society and a consumer to actually make that change. And it's an enormously humbling for someone like me who's worked for so long with trying to create a societal change and encouraging people for so long to make the shift and be confident and optimistic and positive that it will work. And to see in our communities at the moment, there has been changes and we are shifting, and whether or not our politicians are following that, we as the people have the power to do that. And it starts with your home. You know, think of your little houses, you know, your little shelter and your little protected area. How can you better protect where you live and enhance your own space and environment? So they're the little things you can do no matter where you are. And if you have the ability to go bigger, you know, help your local organisations. If you are in a financial situation, to actually help donate to different charitable organisations in this sector. We are all struggling at this time with it's a very unusual year. So you can definitely help by giving not only time but also financially if you're able to. But it doesn't cost anything to pick up trash.
Yeah, I think that speaks to one of the major themes we've touched on and discovered by chatting with so many different amazing people over the course of this season, especially in the Watershed Chats series, about the astonishing understanding that making a choice that is healthier personally tends to be a healthier choice ecosystemically as well. So yeah, those choices can make a huge difference on two scales, which is just makes it seem even easier and more commonsensical.
Yeah.
Liz, the aspect of the Dolphin Research Australia group that I look at and find really exciting is the idea of reaching kids and people who have got such a enthusiasm for the ocean, and especially in this region, that's obvious that there's a real enthusiasm for everything coastal. But we spoke just recently about what comes next, because when we first met, and it was 15 odd years ago, and we're doing things like visual petitions and trying to popularize some of these issues and get them spoken about, I feel like everyone knows to a degree that there are many problems that we are at the root of, but perhaps less known are the solutions or the courses of action we can take to correct those imbalances and to remedy those problems. So I really like your thinking about zooming in with kids and figuring out ways to really direct that energy and that real deep care and concern, and probably a lot of frustration too. Is that something you've been encountering more so in recent time, that there's a real wave of care or concern that's there that we need to do something with and need to direct right now?
Yeah, a lot of our marine education programs really focus on connecting children and youth to their surrounding space. Why should they care about that bird that sits in the tree? Why should they care about that tree that sits in their backyard? And how does that connect to the marine environment? And how does that affect everything downstream and out into the ocean? So we work a lot with youth on really harnessing and encouraging and nurturing that connection. And from that, you can instill stewardship and empower them. They get that connection, and that connection becomes very deep with some of these kids, and they grow up with that. A lot of our work has been done with quite young kids, early primary kids so far, and those children, the first ones that our education team taught, are now in high school, and all of that teaching they still bring up a lot, and to have that feedback from the teenage years is really humbling. But we get the feedback of, well, what's next? I want to be able to do all this, and I'm really concerned about climate change, and I'm really concerned about the loss of forests and the loss of our koala populations, or I'm really concerned about seeing a lot of rubbish on the beach. What do I do? How do I help? So what we are always trying to do is create different opportunities for youth of all ages to continue that connection. We definitely don't want this next generations to be feeling angry that the state of the world is endangered and their future is uncertain. We want to make them I guess optimistic, and again, make sure that they're positive and empowered and direct that energy in the right way. So that's what we're always trying to make happen with our education programs.
One of the things you said about trying to connect kids with why a tree is important in their backyard, it just struck me as such a modern question that necessitates modern solutions, because these are questions that in pre-industrial societies, children would have known that the value of a tree in the backyard is for fuel for the fire, because they would have been collecting it, or fruit or food, or for building a lean-to, and it's that fundamental sense of disconnection that has really allowed us to spiral off and treat the living world in the ways that we do, because we've forgotten, and a major part of that remembering is, even for those of us who have grown up in that state of disconnection, it's our responsibility to rediscover connection and also create environments where the reconnection and the relearning is possible. And that's what's so beautiful about some of the work you're doing now, is fostering that relationship and allowing that relationship to develop and deepen over time.
Yeah, definitely. And, one of the things in our education work too, that I work a lot with adult education and also community education, whereas some of our other educators work with kids a lot more. But one of the things that I've also observed is that disconnect with adults in such a profound way. And, you know, kids are wonderful little molds and you can influence them through their imagination, but they're little sponges at the same time, and they're amazing how much information they can take in. How you connect adults that are kind of also often stuck in their ways is a whole other set of challenges. And one thing I love to try and connect people with is, you know, why should they care about the dolphin all the way out there or the whale all the way out there? And, you know, we're lucky here where, for example, our humpback whale populations have, you know, come back from the brink of extinction. And it's a really positive story in one way. So why should people continue to care about the conservation and protection? They seem okay, like the dolphins, they're all okay. But to connect people to how we are all similar, I mean, we're all fundamentally similar with these animals, that we are all mammals. What do we need? We need air. We're all breathing the same air. When I say that to a lot of our adult groups, there's a moment and you see it in their eyes and you think, I've got your connection there. And that's a very powerful thing to connect. And I guess, you know, in another sense, it's connecting breath, isn't it? So it's the very soul of our being. We need that first and foremost.
It's so interesting that the cetacean world has like one of the easier hooks or igniters, whatever like sparks for people. When you say like, it's an interesting situation where it's been decades where people know there's a great connection between humans and whales and dolphins.
And there's also been a really obvious connection in hunting and fishing of whales. It's like a very visual problem that has a very simple solution compared to something like industrial runoff, which is more nebulous.
Yeah. So it's a funny moment right now, and it's almost like that book Fathoms that's just come out from a Perth writer, where she explains how, you know, when we see a cetacean dead on the beach, how historically that's something that is a boon to all life in the local area, and will just sustain so many other creatures, and how now it's a completely different story. We have, you know, really a lot of the time a situation where the animal is picked up and taken to a dump, to a rubbish tip, and the toxins and the bioaccumulation in the animal is just off the charts. And so we've got a strange situation where here in Australia we're looking at this amazing humpback recovery, for example. But then when you zoom in a little bit more, there are these other factors that are more insidious, that are more about the larger systemic problems that are happening, the quality of the water that they're living in, the quality of that air, the food they're taking in. And so it seems to me like if we're going on this tangent where you're talking about connecting with adults, trying to turn that switch back on with adults, that this is a bit of a route that we can take right now, where it's like, okay, stay engaged, keep caring, because this is what's actually happening. Yeah, we've got these populations here that you might see and we think, oh, cool, it's all sorted. But actually there's a lot more going on beneath the surface, and that are not as simple as just stopping a few industrial hunters from taking out individual animals. This is bigger connections that need attention.
That we all play a part in.
That we're all a part of.
Yeah.
Is that something you're finding you're talking and trying to navigate through and with people these days?
Absolutely. And, you know, I kind of call them the invisible threats. You know, they're the ones that are harder for us to prove the true impact of on these animals. And often is the case, particularly, I mean, with so many animals and plants as well, that you don't necessarily get a lot of support to quantify or assess how well they're going, or the threats that they're facing, and the degree of the impact of those threats. until those populations or those species are at the absolute brink of extinction. And it's too late. For what we do, a lot of our research is supported financially by the community. It's not a lot. We do work a lot with the government bodies, and everything we do, we feed into policy making frameworks as well. But a lot of what we do is supported by the community, and that shows you, I think, how concerned the community is, but it's also a way of engaging the community in raising the concerns at another level, that we don't want these animals and their habitats to be at the brink. We want to make sure that what we have in place now is to their benefit and enhancing it for their generations and our generations. So those invisible threats are still in our area. A lot of what we're doing, we're still, trying to get a handle on it. There's a lot of just unknowns and potentials. But what we do know is we have a lot of case studies and precedents of animals that have become extinct. And in our generation, we've lost the bahi. We've almost lost the vaquita in the Gulf of Mexico. That is estimated to be in the tens in their population now.
There's also New Zealand, the Popopo, the Maui, under 50.
Yeah.
That was when I went there, was 2011. That was, only 50 individuals. New Zealand.
Yeah.
So...
And that's the madness. I mean, we know the problem. We know how to fix the problems. But why aren't we? And this is where the community can not only help us quantify it and be part of that solution, but we can also, again, go back to our everyday lives and think, what can I do? While our politicians stumble and fall and want all this evidence, which is, yes, it's coming, but sometimes science can take some time to crunch the numbers and actually, get that quantified. Unfortunately, the culture of politics is not, I believe, at the moment reflecting what our communities want, at least our local communities. And there used to be a lot of focus on what we call the precautionary principle, where in our management of these spaces, we would take precautionary actions because of the threat and the level of threat that activity posed to these animals. Whereas now it's shifting towards more evidence-based without precaution.
Which ends up being reactionary.
Exactly.
You only act when there's a problem.
Yeah, and then there becomes a lot of arguments around that. But when we know all these issues from all these case studies and we can't actually say precautionary, we have a 3 key threatening process here that we need to actually, immediately create an action to minimise it. We end up with problems, and we end up with population declines, we end up with diseases and viruses, we end up with all sorts of problems in our coastal populations particularly. And we need to be vigilant. We need to be optimistic, but we also need to be very vigilant with what our governments, particularly in our Western governments, are doing, because they're doing a lot of things without popularising it. And they don't have to under legislation. It's not like they have to say we're putting in this development or something. But we as the community, we really need to stay vigilant to make sure that they are being, kept to what they're representing, our politicians. Sorry, I'm getting very political.
It's all good.
But it's a big thing. We can't haze out with where politics is at as disillusioning as it can be.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I was kind of hoping, and I know we've done it already, is like some of the key tweaking facts that you can share, or things you've observed about the cetacean world for people to just go into fifth gear with their enthusiasm for that species. You know, for everyone, like, it's pretty obvious that we all love dolphins and whales these days. You don't have to be too left of centre, you know, to know that there is some real magic there. But I do feel like there's a way to deepen our enthusiasm for cetaceans when we start to hear things about the complexity of their communication. Is there anything on the top of your mind where you just go, oh my Lord, look at these incredible creatures and the intricacy in their world?
There's so much.
A long list for you, for sure.
Oh man. But to get into their world, just shut your eyes and listen. And the ocean is not quiet. The ocean is full of all sorts of sounds, and every different animal that lives in the ocean creates some kind of sound, whether that's little parrotfish creating thunks as they're feeding, or whether that's little bivalves snapping. For dolphins and whales, that's their world. They see remarkably well, but they're still very limited in the use of sight in the underwater realm. So they have to be able to hear, and they have to be able to, they use a lot of what we call passive listening, where they're simply listening to the world around them. And they're listening out for different sound cues. And for dolphins, that might be things like, where is the prey? Or it might be things like, for a whale, perhaps it's listening to the sound of the surf to know how close they are from the shoreline. That might be very important for them on their migration. Listening out for each other. What's going on with them over there, you know? And then following that listening, being able to respond to those sound cues. For whales and dolphins, they have some of the most intricate and remarkable communication systems. For the toothed whales, they have the ability to echolocate, which is a way of seeing through sound. They have optimized the properties of how sound travels and moves and shifts and is affected by the aqueous medium. For some of our coastal dolphins, like our wee bottlenose that we were talking about and have got to know so well in our area, they're not only creating a lot of echolocation, which is enabling them to find their way, look at different objects, to look at each other through that sonar capability. They are also looking at prey species with that, then discriminating all sorts of details out of these different objects. But will also create lots of different other types of sounds. And one of their main communicative sounds is lots of different types of whistles. And it sounds just like calling a dog, like you might whistle to your dog. And within their very complex social system, these animals have got to be able to identify each other, be able to locate each other, be able to understand the motivation of each other. And a lot of that is communicated in these whistles. For the bottlenose dolphins and a number of other whistling species of coastal dolphins, they have what we call signature whistles, which is an identity label. Essentially, it's a name. So for some, I can recognise them, not necessarily here, but in Moreton Bay, there's a few there I recognise by their signatures because they're so distinct. So when they're trying to, say, for example, you might have two animals that are quite separate from each other and they want to come together, they'll repeat their signature whistles to actually find each other and come together. A lot of my research has been about the context of different whistles and when they might be emitted and how they might be emitted and how those features might change in different situations. So we know that there's different accents, you might say, with different populations. They also have a number of different what we call non-signature whistles, which they'll use in different contexts. So some might be used more in a feeding context, or some might be used more in a social context. The other aspects that we've looked at is when they're in situations of stress, how does that translate acoustically? How do they express a stressful situation acoustically? And they will modify certain components of their whistles to be able to express that they're agitated or they're very stressed.
So if you were surfing and there was a pod hanging around and you dove underwater and you're out past the waves, of course, so you don't hear all the turbulence, and you dive down, because we can often do that when the humpies are passing by and you listen to their song under there or their calls, and you hear the higher clicks and whistles of dolphins. Is there a signature you could listen for that's a bit general, that would be one where the dolphins are agitated, like if you're in the way or if there's another predator around or a threat to them or something like that? Are there general characteristics that if someone heard this, they could go, all right, I'll paddle out next time when I see dolphins, I'll stick my hand out and see if I can hear a quality to their sound?
Not necessarily. It's hard to simplify it in so much because particularly for the animals we're talking about, that communication is so incredibly complex, and to understand these animals, particularly where we are in Byron, we have quite large group sizes here, and we have a lot of different individuals that'll intermix. So if they're in a situation where they might be stressed out there, if you're surfing and you duck your head under, it's not necessarily something you'll be able to detect in that space. Yeah, so we've done a lot of work with animals that find themselves in situations where they might be trapped in a space. So, and quite often it could be a dolphin that's gone up an estuary and they get stuck in a part of an estuary, and they for whatever reason they can't get out. And in those situations, you can hear an element, and it can be the repetition of the same kind of whistle over and over and over. And then sometimes in that whistle, there'll be, I call it a scream, where you get a greater emphasis on a part of the whistle. So similar to what we do, if we're stressed out or something like that, there's a lot more force in the way we might call a name. Like if our child falls over and hurts themselves, there'll be a big mom, or dad. You can hear the stress. And dolphins are quite similar, but in the world of bioacoustics, you can see it because we've listened to them so much. And you can analyze it, with spectrograms and, doing all sorts of measurables. But out in the wider environment, it can be a little bit harder to detect.
That's part of the awe and wonder of their world, though, because we all know, like, especially here in Oz with all the birds we have that live around the same spaces as us, the sound of the magpie when the postie's coming on the bike, or like if you're agitating some of the birds, and their call. And of course whales and dolphins have agitated calls or warning shots that they send out, but we haven't cultivated that ability to decipher that as creatures who live above the waterline. But it's there, for sure they have those qualities to their calls. And I guess that's part of the magic that's there for people like us, where it's just like we've only just scratched the surface of their world. We've only just dive into that tiny layer on the surface there.
We understand so little. And
so
they communicate in a way that we fundamentally cannot access.
But we know it is just awe-inspiring and is so intricate and is so worthy of our attention and all of our abilities to try and comprehend. And so anyway, I feel like we could go on for days and days and days like this. And I know, that your time's really valuable. I'm super grateful that we've just been able to have just like that, a little scratch at the surface of the dolphin world with you and your work, and just how wonderful it is that there are people like you doing this work, and that we should be rallying behind and beside you, and that our spaces are better for it. I know for me personally, living in this region for most of my life, knowing that you're drifting around the area and surfacing when things happen, strandings happen, or a dolphin's caught in the estuaries, it just feels really great to know that there's someone there writing this down, looking at these patterns, having a long form view of something that most of us only get these short glimpses of, and feel really blessed to have these little tiny moments. But it's just such a valuable community asset to have you all doing this work and doing the deep dives for those of us who might not be able to, or don't have the mettle or the conviction that you have. So it's real community treasure. Really
Thank you so much. You're gonna make me cry if you keep going. But I'll say it again, it's such a great privilege to work with these animals, but for these animals. And a big part of what I do is making sure they have a voice and making sure that they are known, and as individuals as well as populations and species. And, to have some of the records we have of these individuals, we're logging their lives, that each one of these dolphins' lives is counted and their story is being told in some way is very important for us, and to make sure that their voice is heard and that they are conserved, that we are making sure that their life and their environments are healthy and okay. Absolutely.
Beautifully said.
And that video, you saw the video of the dolphin that died?
We were with the guy at Flat Rock a week or so after that happened.
We know who that was.
Really?
Yeah. It was a mature male, but a younger male, and we had it first sighted in 2013 in Byron.
Wow.
As we were all heartbroken. It's watching this go, oh my God. But again, you talk about the connection between surfers and dolphins, and that video just shows you the magic of that connection.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Watershed Chats, our final episode in the Watershed series for 2020. We'll be back next season with more provocative conversations and stories from changemakers themselves in 2021, which definitely sounds like the future. You can keep up with Water People happenings on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. Thanks to our sound engineer and musician, Shannon Soul Carroll, and artist in residence, Chris Miyashiro. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my co-host, Dave Rastovich, thanks so much for making the time to listen with us. Learn more at waterpeoplepodcast.com.